Yeah, maybe I'll get you. That's what my parents did. They had me farmers. Yeah. Hopefully there's 40 acres of like pasture.
It's a mix.
Okay. So it's an active farmer, you know?
Yes. Yeah. Are you good? Good.
I see that.
Where's your kid?
Bye.
Catch up sometime.
Hey, whatever.
What's your dinner? What's it? Yeah, I think AKA so often. So that's quite fun. Perhaps. I'm sure you're ahead of it.
When are you going?
I think next weekend.
Someone's turning. You go to any spots for them? Or see myself, I guess.
We mostly did maybe just spend like one morning before lunch, Subversion. But spend most of the time we had but also, yeah, I mean, explored a lot. A lot of work's great. Just like a bunch of small towns like that.
Good evening, everybody. How are you doing? Good. A little bit of housekeeping before I commence. Just please can I ask everyone to switch your mobile phones on silent. Please be mindful of that. And if you'd like to have a conversation, please reserve that for the end of the discussion, just out of respect of these brilliant guests that we've got here tonight. I think that's very important. The loos are just there. It's not signposted that it's a loo, but I promise you if you go down that corridor, you will find some loos and the exits at the back there. I'm Saima Mohsin. I'm a presenter and international correspondent. I've covered many countries across Asia and Europe and been to the Middle East as well. On October the 7th, Hamas carried out what we know to be the bloodiest, most violent and devastating attacks on Israel and Israelis ever, with more than 1,500 people killed and 200 hostages taken. It's been dubbed the greatest failure of Israeli intelligence in the country's 75-year history. Since then, we of course know more than 3,000 Palestinian civilians and more than 12,000 men, women and children have been injured in Israeli retaliation. In September, Westminster was shaken and in uproar after the revelation that a parliamentary researcher in contact with senior Conservative MPs had been arrested for allegedly spying for China, which he denies, by the way. He is a British national in his 20s who worked in Westminster and had a parliamentary pass. He was arrested in March in Edinburgh under the Official Secrets Act with another man also in his 30s, actually. It's still not known, and the former researcher released a statement through his lawyers on Monday morning saying he is completely innocent. It's still not known, what he actually did for which he has been arrested. He's said to have been in contact with senior Tory MPs, including Alicia Kearns, who chairs the Commons Foreign Affairs Committee, and Tom Tugendhat, who's a senior security minister, of course. Although the case of Tom Tugendhat, he was in contact with Tom Tugendhat before he became a minister.
Don't properly
Okay. Can I ask for everyone also to comment right at the end? There is a time for Q&As with the panel, or if you wish to make a statement, but I prefer questions rather than statements. Thank you. I'm joined tonight by, down the line, I'll go first, Calder Walton. He's one of the world's leading scholars of intelligence and national security and geopolitics, a historian at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Calder Walton is also Assistant Director of the Belfer Center's Applied History Project and Intelligence Project. He co-wrote MI5's authorized 100-year history. And I like this bit, he says on his bio. He lives in Cambridge with his wife and son, Massachusetts, by the way, not in England, who teach, which is why he's down the line, who teaches him his son, who teaches him the true nature of subterfuge. I love that bit. We've also got Isabel Hilton here tonight. She's founder and editor of China Dialogue, which many of you may know, an independent non-profit organization based in London, Beijing, and San Francisco. It's a fully bilingual Chinese-English website devoted to building a shared approach on climate change and environmental issues. She's the contributing editor at Prospect Magazine and chairs the board and Centre for chairs the board at the Centre for Investigative Journalism and has, of course, extensively reported in her capacity as a journalist from China, South Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East and Europe. Then we have Neil Barnett. He's a founder and CEO of Istok Associates, which is an intelligence and investigation consultancy. He's a former journalist as well, with over 20 years' experience in Central and Eastern Europe and the Middle East. He started his career in journalism as a business reporter in Lebanon, and he's also worked in the UAE and Egypt. And Dr. Andreas Krieg. He is an associate professor at the School of Security Studies at King's College London, a fellow at the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies, currently seconded to the Royal College of Defence Studies. Dr. Krieg's also director of the London-based political risk company MENA Analytica. He has spent many years living and working in Lebanon, Syria, Israel, and Palestine, and Qatar. And just to explain, I'm a bit of a fidget. These chairs are not only very uncomfortable, but I have a leg injury, which I got during my time as a foreign correspondent working in Israel, actually. So I have a nerve condition down my left side, so I'll be a bit of a jack in the box. So forgive me. Right. I like to get straight into it. Obviously, that we have I just want to explain, we've got such a wealth of expertise. We started by talking about covering solely, the alleged spy who was discovered in Parliament. Then Pranvera and I from On Frontline discussed, hang on, we should also talk about Russia-Ukraine. And then, of course, the horrific incidents that happened 2 weeks ago in Israel. So we are giving you a lot of bang for your buck tonight with a huge area of expertise. So we will be bobbing around in terms of regions and geopolitics. Given the nature of what's happened recently, I'd like to start with Calder down the line, actually. And Calder, you've written vastly about the Israeli security establishment and how they've operated. It has been dubbed the greatest intelligence failure, that they didn't know this was coming or knew something was coming, but didn't quite gather the right evidence or connect the dots. What do you make of it? We're just checking your audio, actually.
Hear me?
Oh, great. Now we hear you.
Now you can.
Loud and clear.
Now I'm coming through rather too loud, perhaps. You can hear me okay? Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, great. I just was saying it's a pleasure to be with you. I wish I were there in person, but it's good to be with you through cyberspace nonetheless. So first and foremost, we need to be clear that it's far too early to really come to any kind of firm conclusions about the nature of the Israeli intelligence failure. There's certainly, on any reasonable look at this, clearly there was a massive intelligence failure. And indeed, the heads of Shin Bet and military intelligence have said this was a failure that happened under our watch. So they are owning this responsibility. Very briefly, the history of intelligence failures can occur in many different ways, either through a failure of intelligence collection to actually collect the underlying data. They can occur through a failure of analysis. So the data has been collected, but they have not been analyzed properly. It can be a failure of dissemination, of getting that collected and analyzed data to decision makers, or it can be a failure of policy making, of decision makers receiving the intelligence who just choose to ignore it. And we simply don't know right now where that failure has arisen with Israel before October 7th. It could well be a combination of all the different factors. My initial, well, I've been watching this obviously like everyone else very closely, some initial thoughts is that perhaps Hamas was very good at, if you like, going back to traditional forms of tradecraft, which have bypassed Israeli intelligence collection capabilities. So Israel has been spending vast amounts of money and resources on high-tech collection capabilities in Gaza. Did the Hamas leadership revert to old school, only passing secrets by word of mouth, almost sort of pre-modern levels of intelligence? And did that defeat Israeli intelligence collection capabilities? To be seen. There will undoubtedly be a massive inquiry in due course in Israel into all of this. It's by population much, much worse than 9/11 was for the United States.
Thank you. I want to bring you in, Dr. Krieg, on this as well. Are you surprised by the intelligence failure, or looking at how particularly Prime Minister Netanyahu has operated over the years? I've been reading also that there was a lot of focus on, there was some criticism that he almost strengthened Hamas over focusing on repairing relations with the PLO, and sometimes political attentions take over the need for keeping the eye on the ball in intelligence.
Sorry, I think everyone was surprised by the extent of the atrocities and just the sheer numbers and the barbarity and the barbarism with which Hamas was acting inside Israel. But it's not surprising that Hamas would eventually try and break the barrier and try to get into Israel. More so, I think it's been on the horizon for years that, one of the scenarios was a mass kidnap event whereby Hamas is getting through the fence and taking hostages and bringing them back into Gaza. It was a worst case scenario, but it's not something that would have been a complete surprise. It's just the extent of it was an absolute surprise. I completely agree here with Calder in saying that it's way too early to know where the failure was, and I probably, as most of the time, it's on various levels. But what can be said is the strategic environment in which it took place. One, as you already alluded to, is Netanyahu's government, and I think they're solely responsible for that, for kind of building an ideological, political context in which this was able to take place. Netanyahu has, for years, and had said that publicly as well, has tried to empower Hamas to kind of break it, to kind of divide and rule the Palestinian Authority, divide and rule the Palestinian community. And Israel has strategic, and that's not just Netanyahu. I mean, this started really in the 1950s, when Hamas, or the predecessor of Hamas as the Muslim Brotherhood in Gaza, really came about. This is something that the Israelis have strategically empowered and funded because they wanted to kind of divide and rule the Palestinian Authority, the PLO at the time. And that has continued since. So that goes into a hubris and the belief that strategically that Hamas could be contained indefinitely, and that, through this perfect open-air prison that Israel has created, where it controlled, all communications, where, were 3 or 4 lines of defense, underground and on ground, full, and that's true for the West Bank as well. Israel has full access to any sort of cyber flow of information, any flow of information whatsoever, is entirely controlled by Israel, and I would say the Israelis are second to none to actually have the tech to do that. So they had that, and out of this came the hubris to think they will never try it. And this has also informed policy more widely. The reason that Bibi Netanyahu over the last couple of years has not made any effort whatsoever to advance the strategic part of the, of the political side of things, of actually trying to find, advancing the two-state solution any way, shape or form, is also because he thought he didn't have to. Because strategically speaking, he had the normalization with the UAE, he had normalization with Bahrain and Morocco that suggested more Arab states would come and endorse Israel, despite it making not just no progress on the Palestinian side, but actually, stepping back. I mean, the situation Palestinians had gotten worse, not just over the last 18 months, but for quite a while already. And there had been no pushback really, apart from a few states. And there has been the idea that, I've said that time and again, the Israelis have found an operational way to deal with a strategic problem. And that strategic problem has been the lack of a political process of actually coming to a two-state solution. They have abandoned it, and instead of, in its place, building a political strategy, have created and found an operational tool to deal with it, which is intelligence, which has been security in the military. So if you spend that much money on intelligence, that much money on the military, on the IDF, then obviously every problem that you see will look like a nail. You have created a hammer and every problem looks like a nail. So they have always tried to put the IDF in an impossible position of trying to deal and contain the problem, when in reality, what it was required was a strategic approach based on a political decision to actually solve the problem. And Netanyahu didn't have any courage to do that. So in that respect, was not surprising. It wasn't a black swan event. It was something that was, anyone who knows counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, who's understanding colonialism and also, occupation, understands that eventually something has got to give. And unfortunately, it was the terrible event that happened on the 7th of October.
Thank you. There's honestly, each one of these subject matters could be an entire panel in themselves, but want to bring Isabel in, another event that shook Westminster and shocked many of us, although perhaps what I'm going to ask you is, should we be surprised that there are indeed spies amongst us? I mean, it's obvious, isn't it, that countries would have people that they want keeping an eye on one another, and you've had first-hand experience as well as of being labelled a spy for China and MI6.
About six governments,
right.
I think by now. Yeah, I could list them if you like. But it began with MI5, who I was blacklisted from. I had applied for a job with the BBC years ago. I mean, I am about 200 years old, and this is early days, and it was going to be my second job. And I didn't discover till 10 years later that the reason I didn't get it was that I had been blacklisted by MI5 because I spoke Chinese. I'd spent 2 years in China. I have to say, spending 2 years in Mao's China inoculates you against ideology for life. It does not make you into a Chinese agent. However, MI5 saw it differently. The day that this story was published, as a result of some fine investigative work by a journalist who was working for a rival newspaper, David Lee of The Observer, I at the time was on the Sunday Times, I went along to the television festival in Edinburgh and waved a Christmas tree and asked a question, and all the executives crossed and uncrossed their legs on the platform, and nobody wanted to say anything about the fact that MI5 was licensing journalism, in this country, in the BBC. And as I was leaving, I ran into a very well-known Labour MP, Tam Diel, who said, "It's very curious because I had it on the highest authority in Argentina that you worked for MI6. Great, it's a very confusing day, Tam, And not only had he believed it, but he'd put it about London, which is jolly unhelpful if you go to dangerous places. You don't want an MP pointing a finger at you and saying that you're a spy. So when this young man's case was being put about, it's obviously leaked. He was arrested, 9 months ago now? A case has not come to, well, I don't know him. I don't know what he's alleged to have done. But he was a fairly low-level parliamentary researcher for a parliamentary group on China. So he was released on police bail. So whatever he's done, I mean, he was clearly neither regarded as a flight risk nor as an imminent danger to the nation. And yet he's smeared all over the newspapers by Ian Duncan Smith and others. And, you know, that's his career gone. So having had an experience, you know, of a similar nature, it didn't leave me enamored of security services, to be honest. I think that intelligence collection is a very good thing. I think the more we know about each other, the better. So I think a certain amount of espionage is absolutely fine because it avoids misunderstandings. Now, clearly there are security considerations and there are things you don't want, you know, the Chinese spying on. But the people who have really put that on the map in this country are not low-level parliamentary researchers, that people like David Cameron and George Osborne, who invited, against all intelligence assessments, Chinese companies into our critical national infrastructure.
Yeah, you've written about our dependencies on China and the risks of companies like Huawei, China General Nuclear.
Yeah, absolutely insane. And there is a blistering, in fact, the first Huawei contract was under Tony Blair. And there is a blistering House Intelligence and Security Committee report on how that came about. When BT were looking at what was the cheapest bid, because that's what the Chinese do, they subsidize their companies to undermine the competition. In the end, they have a monopoly. And BT was sort of saying, hello, government, is there something we should know? Is there anything you'd be worried about? They got no reply. So they accepted the contract. So Huawei was there. It was absolutely evident by 2012, 2013 that the Chinese regime was not moving in a liberal direction any longer, that it was going absolutely the other way. And if you were following China, it was obvious. And I'm sure someone in the intelligence services was following China. But that didn't stop in 2015, 2016. Cameron and Osborne encouraging, saying we have no problem with Huawei. There was such a problem with Huawei that GCHQ and Huawei had to set up a special unit to monitor millions of lines of code which were being downloaded. They were finding backdoors in the code. Huawei wasn't fixing them. It was eventually discovered that even it wasn't even GCHQ who were doing the monitoring, it was Huawei personnel. It goes on. And that didn't stop Cameron and Osborne doing a deal on civil nuclear power, more critical infrastructure to Chinese to build and operate nuclear power stations, and Huawei to install 5G, on which almost everything was going to run. So civil defense, water, power. I'm sorry? You think a parliamentary researcher is a threat to the nation? Excuse me.
Yeah, okay, I'm going to, thank you. I'm going to quickly read the parliamentary researcher's statement. He still remains unnamed, in case his name is cleared, of course. And he said, I have spent my career to date trying to educate others about the challenge and threats presented by the Chinese Communist Party. To do what has been claimed against me in extravagant news reporting would be against everything I stand for. Well, we will wait and see. Neil Barnett, Isabel was just talking about, you know, there is a need for a level of keeping an eye on our friends, allies, and enemies. But if we look at Russia, Ukraine, and even before Russia invaded Ukraine, they've gone a step farther, and you've been, if that's putting it very diplomatically, isn't it? You've been really concerned with Russian interference in British politics. We've heard about the allegations of US politics as well.
Yes, that's all true. I mean, I was struck by what Isabel said about GCHQ and other parts of the British intelligence services being well aware of what was going on with Huawei. And I think this goes to something actually that links back to Israel, which is populism and the way that populism undermines national security. So in the case of Israel, you know, we see that Netanyahu has alienated the IDF and the intelligence services. He regards them as not personally loyal to him, and therefore something like what maybe Michael Gove would call a blob. And he sought to sideline them and pursue policies with limited advice from them. And also we saw that IDF reservists were demonstrating against Netanyahu's constitutional changes. And this also sent a message to Israel's enemies that the country was divided and vulnerable. Now, in this country, we haven't had quite such extreme populism as you see in the case of Netanyahu or Orban, but I think in the last decade, starting around 2016, we've seen an increasingly populist government. And one of the problems here is the politicization of intelligence. Now, someone like Calder, I think, would probably be able to give a much more scholarly view on the history of this. It didn't start at one point. But I think one point that you could definitely alight on is the appointment of John Scarlett to be director of MI6 after the failed Iraq intelligence, which he passed up to number 10 when he was chairman of the Joint Intelligence Committee. He was rewarded for that act. And increasingly, what we see in the UK, and this goes for the chiefs of the armed forces, it goes for the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police and the chiefs of the intelligence services, is that people are appointed on the basis of their proven willingness to please 10 Downing Street. And this question gets us into things like the appointment process, right, and the fact that we don't have a written constitution and most things are done on the nod, on the assumption that people behave in the right way. But in the last few years, we've had a government where people actively don't behave in the right way. And one of the results of this has been that, and at this point, I say I'm not going to get into any specifics here for a number of reasons. But our services have evidently chosen to overlook some extremely serious things that have gone on in 2014, 15, 16, which they certainly knew about, but they decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Now, in an ideal world, and none of us, in no country does an ideal world exist, the intelligence services should serve the people and the country and not the government of the day. I think in this country, the pendulum has swung a long way in the opposite direction, and the sorts of inconvenient truths that Isabel was alluding to, this is the case in many cases involving Russia and China. And the view is the less said, the better, because it won't please our masters. And that, there we have a strong read across with Israel. And
Russia in particular, can you shed some light on
what they've
been up to or what might be being turned a blind eye to?
Looking through the other end of the telescope, I think, Russia has a problem. The Russian intelligence services have always been explicitly political organizations. And Putin was led to believe that on the basis of having bribed 1,000 or 2,000 of the Ukrainian elite, that the country would fold in 3 days. But they should have bribed, another 40 or 50 million people. And of course, most of that money was stolen anyway. But I think on the specifics of how the Russians have messed around with our system, I would side with the directors of MI5 and MI6 and say no more.
Okay. Calder, let's bring you in as we're talking about Russia. Was the Cold War ever really over for Russia? I mean, we know how President Putin feels about it all and laments the breakdown of the Soviet Union, but also China. And have those countries, Russia and China, taken advantage of the US and the UK's post-Cold War focus on the war on terror?
Well, I think that certainly the way that we learned it in school, and those of us who were living through this history in the 1990s, was that the Cold War was evidently over. It was the end of history, as Francis Fukuyama famously said. From the perspective of key power brokers in the Kremlin, particularly its disproportionately powerful security and intelligence agencies, the Cold War never ended. And in fact, in the 1990s, as Russia's economy tanked, Russia was no longer a superpower, no longer really by any sort of standards a great power, humiliated on the world stage. This, in my view, nothing breeds cold kind of aggression like humiliation. And that's exactly what 1990s. The person of Putin, of course, who rose to become the head of the FSB, the Russian Security Service, in 1998. Putin makes much of his KGB past. I think that a lot of that is some careful myth-making on his part and those around him, that he wasn't actually the professional spy master that he claimed to have been. But nonetheless, when Putin then is appointed by Yeltsin to be his successor in the Kremlin, here we have the moment when the Cold War, that for Russian intelligence never really ended, was now in power again. And it's little wonder that actually, if you look at Putin's public statements in the early years of his reign, it's very similar grand narrative that he's been saying until today, which is the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And he's been essentially on an effort to make Russia great again, using his intelligence services that are not, unlike in the West, are not beholden to any rule of law or political oversight. They don't, as I can't remember who it was who just pointed out, they don't work for the people, they work for the person in charge. That's the fundamental difference. I'd just like to pick up on what Neil said about the specifics of Russian interference in UK politics. Point you in the direction of the UK Parliament's Intelligence and Security Committee report onto Russia, came out a couple of years ago now, but an absolutely scathing report in which the report highlights that when the committee was asking for information about Russian interference in the Brexit referendum, of course, this is something that Putin would try to exploit. He of course knows that wedge issues are the breeding ground for disinformation, for active measures. When the committee asked for MI5 for an analysis of this, the initial response was, I think it was either 3 or 4 sentences long. In other words, this was such a politically charged hot potato that nobody wanted it. But if it's not going to be the security and intelligence services, under whose jurisdiction should this lie? There's a legitimate national security implication of a hostile foreign power interfering in the democratic process. Whose job is it to analyze that? At the moment, I'm not sure where in the UK government that exists. So that's just one example of how the intelligence services were, as Neil said, sort of part of the problem was that they were taking instructions, and the whole atmosphere was so politically charged that, in the words of the report, the UK government during the war on terror dropped the ball, took the eyes off the ball regarding Russia. So I think that I'll just conclude by saying that I think that when the history of this comes to get written, we'll see that the post 9/11 war on terror and a huge diversion of national security resources in the US and the UK to dealing with counterterrorism, that was the moment when Russia and Chinese intelligence went on the offensive. And what I fear is going to happen now, again, is with the understandable pendulum going back to counterterrorism now, are we going to again lose sight of Russia and Chinese intelligence operations? it is this balancing act of finite resources and too many challenges coming our way.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that with you, Calder, and you, Dr. Krieg. Oh, sorry, Neil, did you want to come back on anything to do with Russia?
Yeah, I mean, just one brief point from what Calder said. One of the issues in the Brexit referendum was to do with money laundering. And an absurd situation arose, like something from Yes Minister, where the National Crime Agency said that while money laundering was within their remit, counter-espionage wasn't. It was MI5's job. And MI5 said, we don't do forensic money laundering investigations, and therefore nobody did it. And this was just a cover for a reluctance to do something that might cause trouble. And you know, a point that should be made here, which is not just a bureaucratic point, is that the employees of MI5 and MI6 are crown servants, not civil servants. They answer to the crown, which means the people. And I don't think that's an academic point, but I think it may have been forgotten more in the upper ranks than the medium and the lower ranks.
How do we address that, Neil? Any suggestions?
I think it's a failure of leadership, and as long as the government of the day can appoint whoever they fancy to lead these organizations, that will open up a vulnerability. So a number of democracies have much more developed processes for appointing these kinds of roles, and I think we should look at them as an example.
Thank you. Andreas, Krieg, picking up on the point about focus on the war on terror, the pendulum now shifting back to that given what's going on in the Middle East. I was just looking through my phone actually, not because I was checking my text messages or TikToking, just to be clear, I was looking for a quote. I'm not on TikTok, too old for that. President Joe Biden said when he was in Israel, it's a longer quote, but I'm just going to cut to the end, where it says, after 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes. He was referring to the retaliation, the airstrikes, asking Israel to stay within, international law, and concerns about the violation of international law. But there were presumably, we know about intelligence failures around 9/11, WMD with Iraq, we've already mentioned it tonight. What are the lessons that we should have learned or and can apply today?
Yeah, excellent. To come back on Calder's point, or continue the same thought, I think the pendulum, I might say something controversial, I just published a book called Subversion, which is about the strategic weaponization of narratives and how we can push back. The case studies were Russia, China, and the United Arab Emirates. Three countries that have been involved in meddling in our information environments here. And I think when we talk about intelligence, I think there are three kind of activities. I mean, one is espionage, one is subversion, and another one might be sabotage. And we are too much focused on the espionage side of things, and it's the subversion thing that we have kind of dropped the ball on. And one case study that I'm developing is the focus in the UK, ripened by the UAE on the Muslim Brotherhood, where you have had very strategic interference by a Middle Eastern country trying to ostracize Muslims and British Muslims in this country. And that continues the point about the pendulum about CVE. I think the counter-violent extremism industry, which has been so strong post 9/11, has created a sort of vicious environment whereby a lot of resources, a lot of people were dedicated to trying to find Muslim radicals. It was a fairly small threat, which was inflated to such a gigantic degree that most of our services have been preoccupied with that and not looking at where the actual challenges were in terms of subversion. And I think when we now move forward to what's happening in the Middle East, one of the great things that I've unfortunately, or the tragic things I've observed now is the extent to which weaponized narratives by both sides of that conflict, but particularly Israel, because Israel is a state nation with extensive resources, have weaponized narratives in our communities here in the UK. And you know, we rightly stand up when it's the Russians doing it on various occasions. We stand up when it's, you know, when it's the Chinese doing it. But now Israeli adverts have been all over the place, politically motivated, highly emotive adverts on YouTube, on other social media sites where you can't avoid it, where Israel is trying to push its message of this conflict to all kinds of people, very emotive, very much a trigger-happy sort of interference. The problem I have with this is that this conflict is a conflict in the Middle East. Certainly people should be emotionally involved one way or the other, but it shouldn't go to the extent that we're mobilizing communities on both ends of that polarized spectrum in our own midst, with, you know, Jews getting attacked, Muslims getting attacked on the other side, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism being stoked on both sides, because both of these divides, and I've got to say the Israelis are a state actor, they're supposedly a liberal democracy. We would expect them to take a more balanced view on this. The problem I have with this is that I find this interference extremely subversive. And what it leads to is a culture of vengeance, a culture of victimhood that I think is now in Israel in particular, and possibly also understandably, obviously after what happened, but that culture of victimhood that the Americans felt post 9/11, that had led to all these terrible mistakes and strategic failures, not just in the intelligence service, but the idea of going to Iraq, Afghanistan, and then what we're going to do there, without the whole war on terror was built on a lie, and it was built on assumptions that were never properly tested, because it was all about vengeance. It was, and there's loads of social psychological studies over how these decisions were driven internally in Washington, how they were driven inside the intelligence services and institutions, and how they were driven inside among American people, but also among, the British public, where people were trying to mobilize us. And so when I look at subversion, I look at the mobilization effect. How do you weaponize narratives to mobilize people to do something or abstain from doing something, so demobilizing them, that they otherwise wouldn't do? You change not just the attitude, but you change behavior. And that, I think, is where the Russians have gone a couple of steps ahead and have never stopped doing what, Calder was talking about, active measures, but it's active measures in a social media environment, which is so much more toxic. And I have a fear that what we're doing now, looking at the Middle East, is that we're getting dragged back into a highly emotive debate where we justify war crimes, violations of international humanitarian law, just for the mere reason that, this was all based on a tragic, totally barbaric terrorist attack. And I think, cooler heads need to prevail to an extent. And for that to happen, we need to take these weaponized narratives out of the equation. We see that our government here is taking a very strong position on this, and not based on principle. I think the Tory government is taking a position where we stand with Israel, not we stand with principle. And while this might be justified to an extent, I find it very problematic that they're not standing equally with the civilian casualties on the Palestinian side.
Yeah, that's almost alluding to what you were saying about populism leading political and strategic and military issues, isn't it, Neil? Calder, do you want to come in on learning lessons from the past, particularly from 9/11 and Iraq? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry. Been doing this for how many years, still don't manage to press the correct button. I think that as far as Israel is concerned, as I said at the beginning, they will undoubtedly have a 9/11 style commission, which will go over all of this. I do think, though, that what we are, as well as what Andreas just mentioned about subversion, the one that perhaps people talk about even less is sabotage, and the potential for, as Isabel mentioned when we were talking about Huawei, for a hostile state like China or indeed Russia to conduct sabotage in our critical infrastructure. So in the US here, I think it's about 80% of critical infrastructure is held in the private sector nowadays. And it just takes one entryway into that, as the Colonial Pipeline incident revealed a couple of years ago, to show the vulnerability, the threat surface that a hostile state can then exploit. I just got back from a conference for an outfit called the Cipher Brief, and certainly one of the predominant fears that U.S. government officials and those in the private sector are talking about is this fear of sabotage, of malware being inserted into critical infrastructure that can then be flipped on like a switch. So the lessons are, yes, of course, states have spied on each other forever. They have conducted subversion to try to influence foreign policies to their advantage, and they've conducted sabotage. It used to be men and women operating undercover, to destroy critical infrastructure during the Cold War. If World War III were to break out, now all of those things are going seamlessly, as Andreas pointed out, between the physical world and the cyber world, with an interplay, floating between the two. So it's the same principles. States are doing it for the same reasons: spying, instigating subversion, and sabotage, but now with new capabilities, thanks to this new digital world that we're living in.
Neil, can I bring you in on that in terms of the digital realm? And I'd like to come to both of you, actually. Neil, if you would chime in on Russia cyber attacks, what they're doing in the digital space, and perhaps Isabel as regards to China. Thank you.
A friend of mine's father, who's a very successful businessman, died recently, and on the last day of his life, he said to his son, "The internet has ruined everything: culture, business, and politics." And I've some sympathy with that. In the Cold War, if the Soviet Union wanted to address the man in the street in the UK or France or the US, assuming there's a screen with 100 pixels, they could maybe get some leverage over 1 pixel by doing things like surfacing a story, like, for example, the idea that AIDS was released by an American experimental laboratory, which was surfaced in Africa and then appeared in the Mail on Sunday. Or they had other equally clumsy and ineffective and small-scale efforts, like having these idiots on the street corner on a Saturday selling a socialist worker in provincial towns and so on. And it was desperate, and it really didn't work. And I think that partly explains why there was such solidarity among Western populations during the Cold War, because their minds hadn't been messed with. There were efforts to mess with their minds, but they didn't work. Now, if you fast forward to today, the adversary, in this case Russia, can have over 90% of the pixels, in a sense, because you now have this completely unregulated, there's no monopoly of the means of communication. You have this completely unregulated internet, which is an interactive forum, which allows people not only to receive information, but to interact with it and then to become, in a sense, radicalized. And then you have the proliferation of media platforms, so that, using in the US, for example, First Amendment rights, it's now possible for people who are consciously working in the interests of Russia to establish themselves as bloggers or journalists, or indeed for people who are what Catherine Belton calls trusted custodians, trusted intermediaries of Russian commodities money from the 1980s, who've become fabulously wealthy, to set up media platforms. And again, there's no pushback on that from the services. And so the ability to get inside people's minds, to directly address them, has gone from maybe 1% to over 90%. And this is the effects of this can't really be overstated, I think.
The Chinese have learned a lot from the Russians. We have, of course, now Xi Jinping and Putin's infinite friendship, or friendship without limits, I think they called it. They haven't been as good at those kind of, that sort of information sabotage as the Russians have been, but they're learning and they're putting an awful lot into it. So there is, I think we need to think of security threats across a broad spectrum when we're looking at, where we are now and how we got here. We've had 30 years of globalization, which is absolutely fine when you trust your partner, you trust your business partner, you trust your supply chain. When that trust goes, you find, as Germany found with Nord Stream 1 and 2, that you have put yourself in a massively vulnerable situation. Now, China's the world's second biggest economy. We have all sorts of vulnerabilities of supply and economic dependence on China, which, we could have thought about 10 years ago, but we didn't. Just as Angela Merkel could have said in 2013, maybe Nord Stream 2 is not a great idea. After all, Russia's intentions in Crimea were then very clear. But somehow politics, the idea that ideology triumphs the use of your senses or the application of your analytic intelligence. I'm afraid we find that, repeatedly, including, of course, in Iraq. So what should we worry about? Well, once you start worrying, there are really quite a lot of things. There is that dependency. There is, on the hardware side, there are things like, someone I know is actually an ex-book, has just done a report on the Internet of Things and the data collection that the Internet of Things offers. Those things are all made in China. Is your e-bike reporting your movements back to Beijing? I'm not sure. It could. Certainly Hikvision security cameras are very, very well placed to, monitor whole sections of society and in some sensitive areas. There is a big argument about electric cars now. And when you look at what the approach that China takes, China wouldn't allow that to happen in China. When Didi Chuxing, which was the Chinese Uber equivalent, wanted to list in New York, the party stepped in and stopped it on the eve of the listing, saying, no, 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 you have data. We are not allowing any risk of that data going abroad. So if China's really that concerned about Chinese data going abroad, maybe we should start to think in reverse. Maybe China sees a massive and useful pool of data for collection here. Just on the, as it were, the kind of software side of warfare, the information war, which I absolutely agree with, has been hugely important. It may not seem that Chinese propaganda is very effective here, but if you go to Delhi or Chile or Argentina and talk about Ukraine, for example, you get back the Russian story. And that's a lot of that is Chinese media services, it's Chinese news agencies where other news agencies don't exist. It's just, and the retreat of things like the BBC or things like other, Western liberal propaganda efforts. We have abandoned huge swathes of global public opinion to a very targeted and very well-financed operation. And so when you turn around, you say, where are the votes in the UN? No, they're not there anymore. They're not there anymore because a lot of the world no longer sees it as we thought they did or as we do. And that's, another dimension of a strategic competition that we have paid insufficient attention to.
Yeah, Calder, I just saw you vehemently shaking your head, agreeing and putting your thumbs up. Did you want to add anything? Or?
No, just how different this picture seems in the so-called global south, and how our perspectives on issues like Ukraine seem so clear-cut to us, but actually, thanks to and amplified by Russian and Chinese mis- and disinformation into audiences in the so-called global south, it looks very different. And this is, in many ways, I predict that the so-called global south, developing nations, what used to be called the third world, will play as significant a role in this geopolitical collision that we're living through right now between East and West as they did in the Cold War in the last century. There's going to be a battle for hearts and minds in a similar way, with all sorts of intelligence agencies trying to target audiences and subvert countries. And we can already see how this is escalating. And the big lesson from the last Cold War was it really worth it? You know, what was all that actually about? And having spent longer than I care to admit looking at some of those operations in Africa and Southeast Asia, I don't have a good answer to that. What was it all about? And I fear that we're being sucked into this again.
I'd like to add that also, obviously, people have their own opinions because of what you just mentioned, their experience in the global south as well, of course.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
not just Russia and China influence, their own lived experience. I'm conscious of the time, and I want to give, there's a packed house here tonight, which is great to see. So I want to give everyone a chance to ask their questions too. Final point from you, Isabel, please, which is, while you remain concerned about Chinese influence, you also want to promote collaboration, and you see the need for collaboration. So how do we strike that balance?
It's difficult because, on the Chinese side, the Chinese are not making it particularly easy. But, I spent the last 16 years working on climate change. And trust me, if you think you have troubles now, that's going to make things infinitely worse. And in the first part of my career, I did a lot of work in war zones and societies under stress, and I know they produce very bad politics. And the level of stress that climate change is going to induce means our politics are not going to improve. So our capacity to make a transition in time is going to diminish. We need to do it sooner rather than later. China's the world's biggest emitter. It's also the world's biggest producer of all low-carbon technologies. It has the biggest installed capacity in renewables, et cetera, et cetera. And there is a sort of Cold War lesson, if you like. We have to manage our differences. We have to look for the areas of mutual benefit. It's not easy, but we can't let it be drowned out by the noise that we have long-term as well as short-term problems, and that we need to stop things getting worse if we can, and if we can find a way to manage our differences and find some, at least, grounds for collaboration, for example, on climate change, I think that's still worth fighting for.
Thank you. Thanks, all of you. So this is where my questions end and your questions start. And I just want to add as well, Isabel, being a journalist, and I've worked in 28 countries, I've also been labelled a spy many, many times. But I've been labelled RAW, the Indian Intelligence Agency, Mossad, Israel, CIA, the United States. They've picked everyone but MI6, and, I happen to be British. But
Can I tell you my most unlikely accusation?
Please do.
I landed in DRC, Congo, and I was arrested as a spy for Rwanda.
Well, hidden in plain sight. Right, okay. I think someone's going to bring a mic round. Is someone? Right, we've got two. So if we can get one to the person at the back there, and one, the gentleman in the blue shirt, put his hand up first. And then once they are done, there's a gentleman here in a brown jacket. We'll go at the back first, thank you. If I can ask you, just say your name, who your question is directed to, and if you'd like to, who you work for or represent, that would be great too. You don't have to, though.
Sure. I'm Tahira Dinesh. I'm in human rights law. I actually have this question to the entire panel, and I'm sorry I was out part of the presentation, so maybe I missed this, but I didn't hear much reference to Iran. Iran is a protege of China and Russia. London happens to be the political capital of Iran. The mess that we see in the Middle East at the moment is funded and instigated by Iran. Iran has 18 other organizations similar to Hamas by some reports that are part of this process. What about Iran? What are we going to do with them?
I think Dr. Andreas Krieg would be well placed to answer that.
Well, it is a complex question to an extent, but obviously we're at the moment still talking about Gaza. knowing that the next round of this game will involve a ground invasion. A ground invasion will trigger some sort of response by what Iran calls the axis of resistance. And that could include Hezbollah, that could include Shia militias in Syria. And one thing nobody talks about at the moment is quite highly armed and trained new militia groups in the West Bank that have not affiliated with the traditional actors. And then obviously, if you go further to the Gulf, you get the Houthis, you've got Shia militia, the Hashd al-Shabi in Iraq, for example, equally under Iran's wings. The thing is, what I want to talk about, though, what I want to say, though, is that there has been a lot of talk recently, wrongfully, about Iran's direct involvement in the attacks against Israel. While obviously funding has come from Iran, training has come from Iran, technology has been transferred to Hamas from Iran for a long period of time, it's all been well documented. On this very particular occasion, it's not so that the Iranians, there is no evidence from any intelligence service, the Americans, Israelis, and the Arabs as well, have all concluded that there was no direct involvement of Iran in that particular attack. Because we have to be also very careful by pointing the finger at Iran right now, because there's another, talking about weaponized narratives, there's another front, particularly in Washington, of hardcore right-wing hardliners who are anti-Iran, who are now trying to build a casus belli of saying we need to bomb Iran now, and we need to bomb that regime, which is also, and we need to be very careful that we don't go down that slippery slope. So based on the facts that we have, obviously there is an axis of resistance, they could get involved, and I think that will make it far more messy, and that's my greatest concern, is that it will create a situation where the Americans, who have now already sent 3 warships into the region, have now 2,000 extra Marines on the ground, and are supporting the Israeli war effort wholeheartedly, endorsing a strategy which is, in my opinion, not a strategy. It's an operational military approach with no end in sight, supporting that, and thereby become complicit in a war against proxies of Iran. And that in itself could create a situation whereby America gets directly entangled in some sort of confrontation with Hezbollah, which would, down the line, could bring Iran in. But I would say that Iran has absolutely no interest in a war, in a direct war, because they have this network of different militia actors and groups that they can call upon to dissociate themselves and have some plausible deniability in terms of the operations that they can run against Israel, against the US, and other Western targets. And so, that this is where the escalation lies. This would be a regional conflict that nobody can really control. And unfortunately, we're talking about populism. Bibi Netanyahu has always been one of the most hawkish hardliners, anti-Iran, who might now find an opportunity to hit back at Iran. And obviously, he would be making a huge mistake.
Thank you. Gentleman in the blue shirt.
Yes, my name's Richard. My question's quite a personal one, because when we invaded Iraq, I was actually a diplomat in a foreign country, and I became a target, so I'm not very pleased about some of these people when you've personally experienced it. So my question is, what I'd like to know is, based on what you were saying earlier about how the various services kind of do and don't do things, I'd really like to know why is it that, and this is not a political point, why is it that our former Prime Minister is allowed to go off for parties with SVR and FSB people, i.e. Russians, and nothing has happened about it yet? It really concerns me. Having sort of, spent my time in my life sort of doing stuff in my country, I look at this guy and think, who is allowing this to happen, and why? I don't worry about a young guy that's probably got a bit of fantasy around being a spy and stuff. That's irrelevant. But when your former Prime Minister is he being protected? What is going on? That's my question.
Thank you. I think it's a question we've asked as journalists many times. Would you like to come in on that, Neil?
Which former Prime Minister are you referring to?
I'm assuming we're talking about Boris, right?
Because there's definitely more than one candidate.
Oh dear.
Yeah. I mean, I think this comes back to the problem of the services being timid and reluctant to upset their political masters. I don't know. Are they not providing the necessary briefings on associates and people that they're dealing with, or are those briefings simply being ignored? But one of the two must be the case, and I think it's extremely dangerous, because we seem to have intelligence services that will turn a blind eye just in order to avoid, and I guess this is for people who study what's used to be called the British establishment. The MO of the British establishment is that one must not, to be a part of it, one must not create waves. And that seems to have been externalized to an extraordinary degree by the heads of the services in the last couple of decades.
Can I jump in with something?
Yes, please do, Calder. Thank you.
Comment, which is, as bad as the situation seems over there with the odd embrace of Boris with former KGB types and the flow of Russian money into the city over the years that produced this cottage industry of people making vast amounts of money from it, and also political apathy. As bad as it looks over there, let me just tell you, speaking from the States, it's nothing as bad as the situation over here. And the thing that we haven't talked about so far is, in my view, the real prospects of a Trump second term, which will resurrect all of the questions that have existed about Trump and his embrace of Putin and the flow of Russian money into the US. The hard right and the GOP over here is proactively promulgating Russian misinformation propaganda. So as bad as it is there, be thankful, ladies and gents, that you're not over here, because things are going from bad to very bad over here.
Thanks, Calder. I think you've just given us our next panel discussion as well. You have the mic? Yes, gentleman in the brown jacket.
My name is Guillaume Lefort. I have an extractive metallurgy business. My question, I'm going to pivot a bit my question, because my question was linked to Richard's. But perhaps in adding another layer, and perhaps you know specifically about that, I was surprised to see, and I don't know if it's 100% true, that Putin could have a meeting with Trump alone and just the interpreters back in Finland. I don't know to what extent that's true or not, and who was in the room. Okay, so essentially, my question then links back to Richard. In terms of process, surely there must be processes in place. I think Boris at the time was foreign minister when he ended up with Lebedev in Tuscany or wherever. There must be a process where these things shouldn't be able to happen as part of a government, regardless of whether you're president, foreign minister, just can't happen. And I'm surprised it seems it's sort of collapsed. So yeah, my question is, is there still a process, or these guys can do whatever they want? Who knows, perhaps the translator of Trump was a sleeping Russian agent for 40 years, and I don't know. I mean, it could be a good movie, but where's the process?
Isabel, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I'm not sure there ever were processes to stop that kind of thing, because it was unthinkable that any president would do that. And it's a bit like the good chap theory of history. The British Constitution works as long as everybody behaves properly. But you get Boris, and you find there are no mechanisms. I mean, the US has constitutional mechanisms for all kinds of things. Turns out they're quite weak, or not as strong as we thought they were. But in that case, and you're absolutely, that did happen. He was alone with Putin for several hours. Nobody knows what was said. There was no note. It's unthinkable that a president of the United States would do that. But it was Donald Trump, and he was the president. I mean, it's appalling.
But we say there's no processes, but there are processes, because King Charles was stopped from going to COP. So
yeah, well, King Charles is not head of government.
But then why are they not the same? What I mean is, I'm just saying, then there should be similar processes for prime ministers and presidents.
Yeah,
right?
but who would exercise that power with the president of the United States? Who would say, you can't do this? He would say, I'm president.
Calder.
Well, that is the exact issue about the documents, the high-grade intelligence documents that are being left around in Mar-a-Lago at Trump's estate in Florida. So that is the exact issue, which is you can't do that. And his argument is that I was the president, and I can sort of preempt, I can declassify this by, in his legal argument is, just thinking about it, I can declassify the documents. And no, actually there's a process and it has to involve the National Archives. So in the US, there is that process. In the UK, I think that we do rest on our laurels of the good chap nature of the establishment, as we've been saying in the panel so far.
Could I just jump in there?
behaviour.
It's a tiny bit more tarnished before we get too self-congratulatory, because just going back to Huawei, the man who set up that evaluation and monitoring center, who was a senior civil servant, joined Huawei 2 months later and still works there. David Cameron, on crashing us out of the European Union and stepping down as Prime Minister, got a job raising investment money for China. I'm sorry, this is not shiny and clean. It's awful.
Thank you. Sure.
Just add that almost immediately on leaving office, Tony Blair set up Tony Blair Associates and got a contract from Kuwait, a country that has plenty of reasons to want to thank him. And the fee for this project was, I think, $20 million. And the title of the report was The Regional Position of Kuwait. Now, I could have told them the regional position of Kuwait for a much smaller fee. It's just in between Iraq, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. But he got 20 million for it. And, you know, you have to look at the possibility that, and I don't refer to Tony Blair here, or anyone specifically, that you don't have to be a rocket scientist to look at this, that there can be understandings that are reached when you're an elected official or a civil servant or a military officer or whatever, when you're in position, that you will be remunerated at a later point. And this is a way to do things for certain people, I think, in plain sight. And if you don't have a sense of integrity and the flip side, which is shame in public life, then these things become absolutely rampant.
I just wanted to bring in.
I was just going to ask Andreas.
I wanted to bring in the Gulf states because we're talking a lot about Russia. A lot of what's going on in the United States actually involved both the UAE and Russia. That's why I chose them for my book, because they've collaborated. Because whenever Russians can't do something, they use the Emiratis to get there, because the Emiratis are seen as a friendly country. The same is, by the way, true in the UK government as well. You should ask yourselves why in 2015. The British government under Cameron did an investigation into the Muslim Brotherhood with a view to basically condemn them as a terrorist organization. That was done based on a tit-for-tat deal with the Emiratis and done on basis of Emirati lobbying. Then also, and I'm not going to name any names in public, some of it is in my book, but there are certain individuals who've been in government as civil servants who after 2 years, after 2 years in civil service, there's a cooling off period, you can take any kind of job, and some of these civil servants have taken high-paid, six-digit figure jobs afterwards as consultants, and that can only be understood in relation to the kind of job that they've done before. So, we're always looking at the Russians and the Chinese, but they use and work via certain proxies themselves, and the Gulf states have their own interests, and they have far more money to pour into London, and they get their way as well.
Gentleman with the beard there, and after that, if you could hand the mic to the gentleman in the polo neck, and then you're next. Thank you.
Okay. Good evening. Thank you for sharing your information with us. I want to talk about the populist, Israel is being blamed as being populist, or Netanyahu, but for the last 100 years, starting from the US and also the UK, social engineering was in place, and the society was managed through movies, through fear most of the time, and that's actually how they were managed, and also who chooses the new leaders, with what mentality, with what on mind. So what I'm trying to say is, populism is, do you think populism is very much in place in here? Because I recently watched Yes Minister and Yes Prime Minister, and I thought the government in here was managed like that, but for the last 3-4 years, I've been living in here. I didn't really see it happening. So that's one of the things that I want to say. Second, just a conspiracy theory. You know, all the production of Apple is in China. If Chinese government were to say, I'm not producing any more Apple products, how the world economy would go?
Be impacted.
What happened, yeah.
Who wants to answer how the UK government is run, and who wants to deal with Apple in China? Let's start with Apple, in, China.
With Apple in China.
I mean, you've talked about our dependencies on China already.
And Apple is one of those companies, Volkswagen's another, that has, you know, bet the farm on production in China. Oddly enough, though, the company that produces Apple in China is a Taiwanese company operating in China. Apple has, you know, there's a lot of talk of decoupling, which isn't really happening, but there is a certain amount of trying to hedge your bets going on. So we can see a bit of reshoring, more friendshoring, nearshoring, China +1. Apple's going for China +1, it's opening up in India. I think it's quite unlikely that the Chinese government would close down Apple in China overnight because, you know, they have a lot of people, a lot of Chinese work in Apple factories, and Apple's still quite a popular brand, though losing out a bit to Huawei because of nationalism. But I don't think they're going to close it down. But I do think that Apple has a dangerous dependency. It's not alone.
Gentleman in the striped shirt now. Thank you.
I was interested in what you were saying earlier about sort of one of the ways that Hamas might have sidestepped the Israeli establishment is by using old-fashioned sort of tradecraft techniques. And do you think that one of the challenges is that we are becoming too, I guess, like a lot of the Western powers are becoming overly reliant on fancy whiz-bang technology and not looking at the human elements?
Calder, do you want to come in on that?
It could, great question. It could well be. Again, we'll find out. What I would be interested to see is what an open source analysis before the Hamas attack reveals. In other words, part of the explanation could well be for the Israeli intelligence, security and intelligence failure, could well be an over-reliance on clandestine collection through technical means. So focusing too much on secret collection capabilities. But in fact, I mean, certainly looking at the New York Times in the days after the attack, where they were able to pinpoint training camps and so on, well, excuse me, if that was available a couple of days after, it was presumably available before. So while it could be that they reverted to old-fashioned tradecraft, human intelligence, this may have also been hiding in plain sight. And did Israeli intelligence not incorporate open source intelligence sufficiently? That's another whole strand that I'm looking very closely at as we go forward.
Gentleman in the, so we need to wrap up shortly, but I've already pointed to two people. So gentleman in the polo neck, and then gentleman at the front here with the grey shirt. Thank you.
So firstly, thank you to the panel for painting a pretty bleak picture. Will Rushworth. So I'd just like to come back to Andreas' point on the narrative battle, both at home in terms of the influence of Russian dismiss and malign information in particular, but also in the swing states in terms of UN votes, etc. There are a handful of UK government agencies doing counter dismiss and malign information, largely under-resourced, largely over-regulated in terms of what they're able to do for good reasons in a liberal democracy. But I'd be interested from the panel to hear what your thoughts are as to how we can create a more effective force to counter that narrative, both its direct influence on our politics at home, but also in helping us to win that battle for putting out that liberal democracy, those liberal democratic values, and trying to foster that more internationally. Thank you.
Well, yeah, that's a great question. A very broad question as well. we do have a lot of agencies in this country, and unlike other European countries, I think we're fairly good at pushing back, fairly good in that context. I think a lot of continental European countries are far worse. And I think the United States aren't that great either. But that's not supposed to say that we're good at it. What we've created in terms of agencies, what they do is very tactical. So, you know, in the army, we have the 7th Brigade, for example, they do very tactical operations. We have GCHQ, for example, on some of the SIGINT side. What is really required is an independent agency that can work through networks, because that's what is. So in my book, I'm looking at information and disinformation networks, and how do you counter an information network? You fight a network with a network. So what there isn't a single institution, because all of our institutions in government today are not made for this job, because they're hierarchically organized institutions of statecraft. What is required is a network-centric approach of using the whole of nation, of everything that Britain has to offer to advance the interests of the UK and fight back. It's not sufficient to rely on a few crown or civil servants to do that job, because you're up against a highly mobilized network on the other side that work through what I call coincidental surrogates. So, you know, if you, and this is, I think, where influence consists of three things, right? One element is coercion, very transactional. One thing is compulsion, and the third one is consensus building. And what the Chinese and the Russians are not very good at yet is consensus building, but compulsion, very good at. I'll give you an example. If I want you to go through that door over there, I can coercively push you through that. You will always know that I pushed you through that. Persuasion is the compulsion element. You will go through it, I persuade you, I give you money if you go through it. You will always retain a degree of agency. But the beauty of the game of influence is really the consensus space. When I put a fire exit sign up there and say, and bring the fire alarm, you would run through that door. And you would have, I made you do something you otherwise wouldn't want to do, what you didn't want to do in the first place. But you'll never reflect upon it. And that's the kind of space where influence and psyops become very, very dangerous. And in order to counter this, you need to build a counter consensus. And that's where we're extremely poor, for reasons of populism, but also all kinds of other reasons. And the say-do gap, we talk a lot about the say-do gap, right? We say something, but we do something completely different. Nothing has been more damaging, to come back to the point about the global south, nothing has been more damaging than the war in Israel, and not just this war, our Western stance on Israel and Palestine. I work with a lot of military officers and diplomats from all over the world, and a lot of them mostly from the global south, from Asia, from Africa, from the Middle East. And the one thing they always say when we talk about Ukraine is that they say, but what about Palestine? And exactly what we're doing now. I mean, if you look at the images of the statements made by Ursula von der Leyen in the EU, the statements that were made by MPs about, you know, and rightly so, pushing back against what the Russian, this aggressive war of the Russians against Ukraine. We are not making these same statements when it comes to the Israelis. There were statements from Ursula von der Leyen, for example, where we were saying, we have to step in. This is an act of terrorism by Russia, that they switch off, they target critical national infrastructure, switching off electricity and water. That's what Israel is doing right now in Gaza. We're not saying anything about it. And so we need to be more consistent in how we advance our values and our norms, because there are international norms that we always talk about the rules-based order. We advance the rules-based order, but selectively. And Iraq, Iraq was the greatest single problem in our say-do gap. We just about recovered for the last 20 years, and now this war is happening. I think the damage that's been done over the last 10, 11 days in terms of our grand strategic narrative has been so damaging for the long-term credibility of what we're trying to do, particularly what this government is, the damage this government is doing in this country to this, that we're losing credibility. But what is required is really an agency that can work alongside the networks that we have. The networks of the UK are some of the most powerful in the world. London is one of the most connected places in the world. We've got excellent journalists, excellent academics. We've got the City of London. We've got all kinds of markets. The networks that we have to reach, to influence as well. We have to connect with these networks. Government is not doing that. It's not the job of the government and the state to counter this. There's a certain role that they can play, but they're designed to actually counter a network, because they're not working like a network.
Thank you. Thank you.
Can I come in?
Whenever I go all over the world as well, I have to say that it's the lack of consistency with the messaging and how we approach those lines that we draw with individual countries. Calder, did you want to jump in? I have been
really
told we
quick.
need to wrap, but we've got
Okay.
one more question. I've got a question, but so just so you know, if everyone can answer briefly, because we do have to wrap up soon.
All right. Something that we've been sort of skirting around so far, but I think is worth hammering home, that I think in many ways what we're talking about here, how to counter disinformation, narrative subversion, it seems to me is really about digital literacy. And this will be something that, I mean, governments, as Andreas was just pointing out, governments can employ a kind of whack-a-mole approach and cut off a particular narrative. But what we really want is a recreation, or if you like, a new kind of, in America in the Cold War, we had the U.S. Information Agency. It's what, it was disseminating what America stood for. I'm not sure if America knows what it stands for right now, but we'll leave that. But what we're really talking about is how this new generation is going to interact with the internet, and how we will consume information. And there, I think some of the Scandinavian countries are blazing the trail in terms of getting it on school curriculums, so that people going through understand how to spot disinformation, misinformation, and to use the internet in a critical way. That just seems to me woefully lacking here in the US. I'm not sure if it's much better in the UK. And what we stand for, well, actually, the war in Ukraine, I think, is a catalyst for democracies to rally behind, and that it's I would hope leading to a reinvigoration of what Western liberal democracy stands for. So if there's something good to come of it, perhaps it's that.
I'm going to jump in. Sorry, you'll get the last word, because actually this is linked to the question I have, which I forgot to ask earlier. So I'm using chair of panel privilege here, which was connected to what you just said, which is about deep fakes. We've all seen them online. How do we disseminate? Obviously, as a journalist, we have fact-checking, but fact-checking takes ages, whereas, we've seen from the Trump playbook, if you say something, regardless of whether it's true or not, enough times, it reverberates and people believe it. And of course, most recently, the big debate within the journalist community has been working out whether the hospital in Gaza was hit by Hamas rockets, Islamic Jihad rockets, or indeed perhaps shrapnel from an airstrike or an airstrike itself from Israel. Israel produced the audio. Channel 4 News, I think, yesterday. Sky News has also done its own dissemination open source as well. Channel 4 News yesterday analysed the audio that Israel provided, saying that it was fake. So it's very, very hard even for journalists to work out what's going on. How do we do that, Calder?
So
you have all the answers.
Yeah, in 1 minute. Let me
30 seconds.
Point you in the direction of the ongoing work of a colleague of mine here at the Kennedy School. She's a senior fellow at the Intelligence Project, Ellen McCarthy. She's working with the private sector to address some of these issues, particularly through developing new capabilities in internet browsers that will automatically flag and not block, but to put health warnings on information which an AI adaptive tool says, okay, this looks like fake news, or this looks like it's, the image here has been doctored in some way. So you will be on the risk, you will have that alert built in. I can already see in the US there's going to be problems with that, of like, don't let the deep state into your internet browser, but that's a whole separate thing. That sounds really good, and we hope it works. The alarming thing is, though, that when Facebook tried to do some of this recently, of providing health warnings on posts that were state-sponsored disinformation, the ridiculous situation is that it actually made them more popular. So we're at that point of like, you know, don't look at the car crash and everybody wants to look at the car crash. So, but I still, for what it's worth, believe that there are such things as facts and the truth, and that they do matter, and that the reasonable person does actually want to be told, informed, that actually this image has been altered, and that statistically this looks like it's you know, from a spurious source.
Okay, I've been very naughty, so final question.
I was going to ask about what we do well, because we've criticised ourselves quite a lot. But I wanted to focus on maybe, because you talked about not influencing, you know, third world countries and that sort of thing. But what do we do offensively in the same kind of way? Or do we even bother interfering in Russia or in China in the same kind of way as they interfere with us? Or is it just not on our radar?
That was another question I forgot to ask, which was Rory Stewart's been very critical, hasn't he, of the United Kingdom, saying that we just aren't doing enough back. Neil, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I think.
And Isabel.
Yeah, I think where it does happen, it's a very secret squirrel, and you know, on quite a small scale. But what is definitely the case is that, you know, Putin, in terms of Russia, Putin has been extremely paranoid about what he calls color revolutions. You know, the Orange Revolution in 2004 in Ukraine, the Rose Revolution, etc. That this was all a prelude to another color being executed in Russia to get rid of him. And I think that Western governments have been extremely careful to avoid giving any credence to those fears. And, you know, Russian dissidents that I've spoken to have been very disappointed that at one or two inflection points they've looked to the West for help and it hasn't come. And I don't think that's perfidy. It's for exactly that reason that we haven't wanted to give credence to those fears that Putin vocalizes. I suspect that in the end, the current regime in Moscow will collapse without our help. And if we do try and bring it forward, except by, you know, the entirely legitimate means of helping Ukraine to defend itself, it probably would be counterproductive at this stage.
I'll try and be quick. In 1989, students demonstrating in Tiananmen they made a statue called Goddess of Liberty. It was the Statue of Liberty. It's inconceivable that that would happen now. They wouldn't look for inspiration to the United States now. And that brings me to the question I feel we didn't answer on populism. Why, and indeed on misinformation and disinformation. Of course, digital literacy is really important. Facts do exist, but right now they don't persuade. So the question we need to ask ourselves is, why are so many people in our societies willing to believe in Jewish space lasers and the fact that Bill Gates has implanted a chip with every COVID vaccination and so on? And these are very large numbers. I mean, 70 million people voted for Trump the second time round. These are very large numbers. And it seems to me that populism gets its opportunity from government failure. You know, in the 1930s, it followed the crash of 1929. We had a major financial crash. Populism arises when people look to governments and don't get answers, and then are willing to believe any mountebank who comes along and promises magical solutions. What that does, apart from the fact that it disappoints them in the end, it destroys the idea that there is a common narrative, that there is a common truth, that there are facts that you can trust. Because actually the populist narrative isn't proposing alternative facts, so I do remember that phrase. It's really saying you can't trust them in anything. There is nothing you can believe in, and that's the most dangerous thing for democracies. If there's nothing we can believe in, then what's the point?
Literally 10 seconds. Narrative is, I think, because we always talk about mis and disinformation, it's a judgment that we make, that institutions make about the quality and veracity of information, I think is in itself already flawed. Hence, my book looks at narratives, because a narrative is a spin on a fact. And that is exactly persuasion. And it's the spin on the fact that you can't just fact check. You can't fact check a narrative. And as we see with, and I'm not talking about the hospital, but all the other things that go on in this conflict now in Gaza, it's more about the narrative than the fact. It's about how you spin the fact to make them serve your ends. And that is where the problem is, because you can't fact check the narrative. And I agree with you, it's about the root cause of any good information operation. Anything you want to exploit is a grievance, right? You're exploiting grievances. So what government needs to do is address grievances coherently, consistently, and credibly. And we haven't seen that done. And that is the only thing you can do to really reestablish the authority of government.
Can I just five seconds?
Look, I've got Pranvera glaring at me for the last 15 minutes.
5 seconds, I promise. I completely and utterly agree with that. That's probably the most important statement, I think. That the history of covert action, be it US, UK, or Russian or Chinese, it is to be operationally effective, an information operation needs to build on existing grievances. They don't just create things out of nothing. That's so the fact that foreign governments exploit existing grievances, those are wounds that are British made, are American made, and it's therefore in our ability to be able to counter those by addressing the underlying grievances, just as Andreas said. That is absolutely key. And at that point, a hostile foreign state has less fertile ground on which to exploit.
On that note, Calder, Walton, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Isabel, Hilton, Neil Barnett, and Andreas Krieg. That was a really lively, informative discussion, and what I love is when I get to interview people, I get to learn so much too. I hope you learned a lot here tonight. I also want to say a couple of thank yous to the Conduit for hosting us. Rosie, thank you very much. Pranvera from On Frontline, do follow us on social media. She's brilliant at organising these. Keep an eye on it, and the team that set everything up for us for audio and visual. Thank you, everybody. I'm Saima Mohsin, and we're all on Twitter, I think, if you want to follow us. So thanks very much indeed for your company tonight. Good night.